My name is Jerm. This is JermWarfare, the battle of ideas. Iain Davis, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
It's my pleasure to be here, Jeremy. Thanks for inviting me.
I say the trenches because it feels like we're in a war. Do you agree?
Yeah, this is a war. Yeah, this is the Third World War. It's the war for ideas. It's fundamental. Yeah.
Do you think this is in a way deadlier than previous wars?
I think ultimately we're talking about, if you look at the transhumanist element of it, which is, something that Klaus Schwab has spoken about at great length in the Fourth Industrial Revolution and elsewhere, that does seem to be the objective. So we are talking of the ultimate objective. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a short-term objective, but we're talking about the extinction of the human race. I mean, that is certainly on the table. I mean, that's what transhumanism is. Whether our would-be rulers would consider, they'd want to keep some parts of humanity for themselves, perhaps. But I mean, in terms of the vast bulk of the human population, they're looking to transform it, and look quite literally. So yeah, it's a battle for survival of everything. It's a battle of survival for our way of life, our cultures, our the political and socio-economic systems that we value on everything. So yeah, this is it. This is an existential fight, no doubt about that.
Before you break apart the talking points that we're going to discuss, what is the big picture here?
I mean, ultimately, it is seizing control of everything. So seizing control of all resources, seizing control of all economic activity, seizing control of the population in terms of our behaviour and in terms of what we are allowed or permitted to do, and moving towards a system, I would say, of, there's going to be a kind of schism in humanity, with a class of people who are privileged and an underclass, and everybody else will be part of an underclass. I mean, that's ultimately where this is heading.
And this global elite would be referred to as the Global Public-Private Partnership, the GPPP.
Yeah, I think the Global Public-Private Partnership is something that explains how it's the flow of policy around the world. It's how policy originates. It's a concept that comes from the World Health Organization originally. They were talking in terms of global public-private partnerships. And it goes all the way back to the idea of, I don't know whether you're perhaps not familiar of it in South Africa, but that Tony Blair, our former Prime Minister, he had an idea called the Third Way, and Bill Clinton as well. In fact, the Third Way was popular all across Europe as well, with Gerhard Schroeder and people like that were promoting that. That's based on the idea of communitarianism, which comes from people like Amitai Etzioni and people like that. The stakeholder capitalism model of global governance. So, the GPP, the Global Public-Private Partnership, is kind of, if you like, the operating system for stakeholder capitalism. So what are those?
Sorry. No. So, I want to understand this now. So, what is the GPPP? And it sounds funny.
Yeah,
the GPPP and stakeholder capitalism. What are those two things?
Well, stakeholder capitalism is an idea that originated with Klaus Schwab in the 1970s. Klaus Schwab and the think tanks. So Klaus Schwab was quite closely associated with the Club of Rome, and as were the World Economic Forum. So these policy think tanks that I would put near the top of the global, what I call the Global Public-Private Partnership, but that is also. It's not me calling it that. That's how it's been referenced in documents from the World Health Organization, from the United Nations, and so on. Yeah, so stakeholder capitalism was originally promoted. The idea was that it was a more responsive, a more caring type of capitalism, that global corporations recognized that, you know, their responsibility and their complicity in creating some of the problems that we now face on a global scale, and they sold it. The idea was that that corporate governance would be formed by a network of stakeholders, that they would be have an ongoing conversation with non-governmental organisations, the government, and something called civil society, which would be created, which would represent our interests. And there would be this ongoing conversation about how global corporations managed resources and global operations and so forth. That was how it was presented. That was how it was spoken about by Klaus Schwab and others in the 1970s. And then basically that was the idea of it. However, you know, that was the sales pitch. What it actually has transpired, what it's turned out to be, is a way to insert for global corporations, all global, even, you know, the banks, and I would include maybe the Bank of International Settlements and in that as well, to insert themselves into policy making. But more to the point, at the government level, which I would put some way down, I would refer to government within the global public-private partnership purely as policy enforcers. At that level, they want to be able to control markets. So the idea is that the government hoover up our taxation, hoover up money from the public. They're openly spoken about government creating what they call the enabling environment. What they were talking about was governments creating an enabling environment. So this is an investment environment to enable the creation of markets. So when we look at something like Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, they openly state in their documentation that their primary purpose is to create markets for, in this case, vaccines. But it's the creation of markets, which are then, because through the mechanisms of stakeholder capitalism, where the corporations are in constant dialogue with the people that we think are policymakers, although I would argue that they're not policymakers, they're able to be involved in the regulation of those markets. So they create the market, we pay for it, basically. You know, we pay tax to create the market for them, and then they are in partnership with governments to regulate their own markets. So they can basically have control of the market that they are profiting from.
Okay, so let me see if I'm following. The global public-private partnership is essentially then just a fancy name for governments and massive corporations to work together for pretty much the same cause, which doesn't really involve us mere mortals at the bottom.
Yeah, that's a good summation of it. I mean, I would say that the global public-private partnership is the operating system for stakeholder capitalism.
Right. Okay, right, I got you. And if we zoom out just a little bit, just for those who are trying to wrap their head around this, obviously for this is a new concept for many. There's obviously a pyramid of sorts. Now, I would recommend those who are watching to please go to Iain's website. I'll link everything under the video later on. But there's a graph that you've developed. Would you mind just explaining that graph?
Yeah, so I was looking very much at how policy is, how it flows, how policy flows around the planet. So, I mean, it's not everything. I mean, obviously, like, government makes policy on specific issues, but when we're talking about the really big what we might call global agendas. So things like sustainable development and international banking reform and things like that. That starts usually at a global level with a dialogue between the think tanks. So we've got the globalist think tanks near the top, and they're in dialogue usually with the financial authorities. So it starts with the financial authorities, and I would suggest that the ultimate financial authority on earth is the Bank for International Settlements. Then you've got the central banks who obviously, they bank at the Bank for International Settlements, and they're in constant sort of dialogue with the think tanks. And these conversations take years. I mean, this is one of the things I think that we need to understand about the global public-private partnership. They think in terms of decades and in terms of centuries, perhaps. So they discuss the policy. They decide on what the policy agenda is, but they're not legislating. They're not passing hard and fast policies. They're not, decreeing that South Africa does this or the UK does that. They are just setting a policy framework, a policy agenda. From that point, it goes down to other organisations, which we might call the policy distributors. So, a good example would be the IMF. So the IMF, they offer relief money, they offer aid money in exchange for policy commitments. So at that point, even then, that's still not legislation. It's still not hard and fast law, but they're asking for policy commitments from countries in return for investment. Then we get down to the government level, and it's at the government level where the policy agendas, the ideas that have come from think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations and people like that, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs, that then gets converted into policy and legislation which affects us directly on our doorsteps. So it's through the lens of government that global agendas, in terms of what the global public-private partnership are pursuing, gets converted into hard and fast policy and legislation, which then so the government then enforces that upon us. So I think a very good example is sustainable development. We've got the Club of Rome talking about the need to move us towards a new economic model in order to save the planet. They're arguing way back in the late 60s, 1970s. That gets converted through intergovernmental organisations, who I would put as kind of the policy distributors, into a more formal agenda like Agenda 21, and then on to things like sustainable development goals. And then in the UK, that gets converted into hard and fast policy. So in the UK, we've got net zero policy, and then we've got all the laws and everything that are coming out to enforce net zero policy. So something that started at the globalist level, half a century ago, is now a hard and fast policy that we are all subject to, and we are all subject to it.
Yeah. So I've got your diagram in front of me, and the hierarchy looked something like this. So right at the very top, you've got the policy makers, as you were now talking about, and policy makers could be, for example, the Bank of International Settlements as well as central banks. So they're right there at the top. And then just underneath them, you've got the World Economic Forum, Club of Rome, Chatham House, Rockefeller Foundation, and so on. So they would now make policy suggestions, and they can't enforce it, but global governments seem to adopt those policies in many ways, not so?
They don't enforce it. They choose not to go down the route of stipulating legislation, and I think there's a reason for that. Is because then you can't point a finger of responsibility at them.
Right.
But they do enforce it in the sense that if you think about the Bank of International Settlement, and you said to me earlier that you had John Titus on previously, the banks are able to control money. So that the Bank for International Settlement and the central banks control money. They create it out of thin air. It's what Professor Richard Werner called fairy dust. And so if you've got that kind of level of authority, which you get from being the only people on earth that can create money from nothing, then obviously that's pretty powerful. So although governments aren't, well, hitherto I should say, governments weren't compelled to follow policy, but obviously now we're in a situation of going direct. I'm sure you're familiar with that from Catherine Austin Fitts and John Titor. So now we are in a situation where they are directly controlling fiscal policy. So they're basically controlling what public spending. So that is taxation without representation. That's the democracy deal breaker, really, because we elect our politicians and we expect them to be deciding how the public purse is distributed, but they're not. They're not deciding it anymore. Now central banks are.
But aren't governments in some way obliged actually to follow through with some of these policy decisions? For example, the United Nations has member states who sign pledges to listen to their policy proposals.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there are treaties, there are international treaties and things like that which are binding. Yeah, definitely. I mean, for one example, I can't remember the name of the treaty, but there's the treaty that protects Antarctica. So this is an international treaty which countries all across the world have agreed to, they abide by, and they're going to protect the environment of Antarctica. They're not going to exploit it. But the problem with things like those in international law and so forth is that it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything to the global public-private partnership. They are currently pursuing the hoovering up of all resources on Earth, and they are focused on something called the global commons. Now, the global commons are all the things on Earth that all human life relies upon, but no one owns. So things like forests and water sources and the oceans and the sky, those things that all life relies upon. Now they are hoovering them up, and that includes Antarctica. Antarctica is part of the global commons. So there may be a treaty in place to stop allegedly the exploitation of resources in Antarctica. I mean, there's untold amounts of mineral wealth there, but when push comes to shove, none of that matters because they create the law, they break the law. So it doesn't really matter to them that there are these important foundational things in place. It doesn't matter.
And then underneath the policymakers, you've got the policy distributors, and they're one tier below the top tier. And some of those policy distributors would be the United Nations, IMF, IPCC, who handle our climate change propaganda, with the World Bank, WHO, who are very much in the driving seat right now. Philanthropists, I'm guessing you would include Gates and Clinton foundations there, and Soros.
The foundations, yeah.
Yeah. So they are essentially think tanks.
I mean, I think that it's fluid. I mean, I think, people take different roles at different times. I mean, one of the things that you might think is that, Bill Gates, for example, he's been on the world stage obviously he's got a financial controlling interest in the World Health Organization, but he's been on the world stage talking at World Health Organization's summits and so forth, but he's also been whispering in the ears of prime ministers and presidents, and so he's been on a bit of a kind of world tour. I mean, he's met with our prime minister Boris Johnson. I think he's met him 5 times in private. And they're happy to say that, he's met the Prime Minister in private, but there's no minutes. I mean, we don't know what they spoke about. They won't tell us because we don't need to know. So So in that sense, we do know, actually, from the comments of Boris Johnson's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, we do know what those conversations entailed. We don't know the content, but we know what they entailed because he spoke about it. And he basically said, we got the idea from the Gates people. He called them the Gates people. So the Gates people would basically tell us what the policy was going to be, and we would go along with what the Gates people said. Sure. So I mean, no one elected Dominic Cummings, but no one certainly elected Bill Gates to come and tell the UK Prime Minister what the policy will be, but he did. So, I would argue that's policy enforcement. But I also think in Gates' case, he's been so involved in, obviously, the funding of things, Gavi and so forth, the COVAX and all that kind of stuff, that he's part also, I would say, privy to the policy kind of creation agenda as well. This is how policy forms, and this is how it flows from a central global authority down to us.
Here's what's quite scary, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but we're dealing with the top two tiers of the hierarchy so far, and it's all private. We haven't even touched on governments yet.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think if you look at who has got the upper hand in the relationship, so government are always saying about, I don't know how often the South African government say it, but our government say all the time that they are working with their industry partners. So we're working with our industry partners, or we're working in partnership with. Well, a partnership, there's a power play in a partnership. In any partnership, there's always a power play. And if you look at the public-private partnerships that have happened in the UK, certainly, and in America and in South Africa and elsewhere, the private sector definitely has the upper hand. It's the private sector that's driving those partnerships and what they do. I mean, when we're talking about, it's a free-for-all for the private sector. I mean, we only need to look at what they call public finance initiatives in the UK for the building of hospitals. So the partnership, this is, it's ridiculous when we think about it, but this is the way that it was sold to us. This partnership between the government and the private sector is that they would, instead of having to tax us, because the idea was that, we don't have to raise your taxes to pay for example, a new hospital, because the private investors are going to pay for it. Well, those private investors, the private investment money then builds the hospital and goes, there you go, we built your hospital, thank you very much. Now we're going to lease it to you. So they invest the money, it costs them, how many millions to build the hospital, and then they lease it back to the government. And the government then pays them back however much they want. And, ridiculous situation where a hospital that costs 40, 50 million to build, you pay back 300 million. Sure. So that's coming out of the taxpayer's purse. That's taxpayers' money. So basically it's theft. It's theft. It's robbing the public purse. But now they want to do it on a global scale. They want to step up that kind of, I would say, criminal activity. It's usually at the very least, and do it across the planet. That's what they're doing. That is what's happening.
Another example might be, let's say, Pfizer rolling out COVID vaccines for free, but actually the taxpayers are going to be footing that bill in the coming years.
Yeah, Pfizer aren't doing it for free. Pfizer are charging for it. Pfizer have made, I think in the first quarter after the vaccines rolled out, they made an additional profit of 19 billion. So they're not doing it for free. AstraZeneca have made a big thing about doing it for free. I'm not saying, well, we're giving it away for nothing. Look at us, aren't we magnanimous? AstraZeneca had an agreement with, I don't know, it was quite a few governments that they had this agreement. Whereas if they gave the first batch of vaccines free, they would then be involved through Gavi in these developing markets. They would give these vaccines for free, but then they would be tied in as the vaccine manufacturer. So then AstraZeneca then get that whole market, and it's not free now. It's only free to start with, then it's not free, and they tie up the whole market for themselves.
They will always get their money.
Yeah, they'll always get their money, but this is, it's not just about money. It's about control. It's about it's about socio-economic and political control.
Going back to your hierarchy, so at the top you had policymakers, which we chatted about. Then you had the policy distributors, which we chatted about. And now we are 3 tiers down, and we're on the policy enforcers. And that is now where we get the governments coming in, as well as organizations like the CDC and the FDA.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, they're not. Their role is policy enforcement. Officially that's their role as well. But I would say that as I was saying earlier, on the large global agendas, I'm not suggesting for one moment that the government never make policy about anything. I mean, if there's a new infrastructure project or whatever, or there's a change to regulations, then obviously governments make policy on lots and lots of different things. But on the big global issues, for example, in the UK, we're committed to net zero. It doesn't matter who you vote for. We're committed to net zero because it's not coming from the government.
Us too.
It's coming from, So you can vote for whoever you like. You can't get rid of net zero because net zero is not a government policy.
You can't get rid of lockdowns either.
You can't get rid of lockdowns. It doesn't matter who you vote for. You won't get rid of them because it's not a government policy. They're enforcing it, but it's not there. They didn't devise it, and that's how you get coordination globally. And it always confuses me how people can't see that. I mean, when you've got the same policies in South Africa and Australia and the UK and Germany and the US, the whole world, they've all got the same policy.
It's just coincidence.
It's just coincidence, yeah. It's just one of them things, It just happens. It just happens like that.
Iain, you've spoken about the difference between global government and global governance. And there is a difference here. And I think it's very easy for people to get this wrong. What do you mean by those two things?
Well, global governance is, as I said, setting the agenda. Global governance is not about setting hard and fast rules and legislation. It is about disseminating trajectories of policy. So you're given a trajectory of where you want the policy to go. And I would say that within that, probably, certainly in the UK, there's some difference about our approach to how we're going to achieve SDG goals. And there's some difference in France, and there's difference in South Africa and everywhere. There are differences. But the trajectory is governance. This is where we're going. So that's what you will do, and how you try to do that within certain parameters is down to the nation state. But this is what we're doing. So everyone's on board, and that's where we're heading. And that's governance rather than government. It's not. I mean, and people sort of think that the UN, you look at the UN and think, oh, well, they've just, they've had a bit of a chat about things and they've decided that this is what the world's going to do, that, it's all about dialogue and it's all about, responding to problems, but it isn't. It's about a predetermined narrative that will be sold globally. So nation states can't pass laws in another nation state. So the UK can't pass laws in South Africa. South Africa can't pass laws in the UK. So that's a problem if you want everybody singing off the same hymn sheet. You know, if you want essentially the same thing to happen in England as in the UK as happens in South Africa, but they can't pass legislation between each other, how are you going to control that? And that's the advantage of governance, because you're not saying you have to do these policies and you have to do these policies. You're just saying this is the agreed problem and this is the agreed solution. Get on with it.
And they always make it sound noble. We need to save planet Earth. We need to save the future generations.
Yeah. I mean, because they're selling it, aren't they? They're selling the idea. You know, if they were going to come out with, I mean, if you look at, say, for example, net zero, so without selling the idea, so you don't sell the idea, you say, right, won't have any independent transport, you won't have cars, you won't have vans, you won't have anything like that.
And you'll be happy.
You won't have any heating. Yeah, I mean, you won't have any heating in your house, any central gas heating. Everything will be much more expensive. Fuel will be ridiculously expensive. We will control all resources. We will control all food supplies. We will control everything. What do you think? Now, people are just going to go, no, we're not doing that. But so you need to be sold the idea. So then, you know, going all the way back to the Club of Rome, they decide that coming up for an idea to unite all humanity, we decided that things like global warming would be a good idea, which they wrote in the 1990s. We tell everyone that they're going to die unless they do what we say. Then we give them the solution, which is, in this case, net zero. So net zero is what we want, but in order to get them there, we're going to lie to them, and then then they'll accept the policy. Then when they eventually get it, they'll think, oh God, thanks for saving us. That's basically, I mean, that's the that's the sort of Hegelian dialectic kind of approach to the how we are sold these crazy ideas.
Why, Iain? Why are these global power structures pushing for all this? Is it really just about control?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can go back in history a long, long way, and just, you know, I mean, it's all tyrants have been the same, haven't they? I mean, what you're asking me is why are there tyrants? Why are there tyrants? You know, I mean, is it a lust for power? Is it a sense of superiority? You know, is it fear? You know, are they frightened of us? I mean, who knows why a tyrant? I mean, there's lots of people that talk about, you know, that there's a strong strain of sociopathy and you know, these people are basically psychopaths and so on. I mean, I don't think it. Now, I think there is an element to that in terms of them seeing humanity as lesser, that they see themselves as a breed apart. I mean, you can go all the way back to the, you know, like the Phoenicians and the Venetians and the creation of the banking systems, and see that there is what a lot of people refer to as the dark nobility, that are black nobility, that are there's a lineage there. But then you get new money, you get modern people, you know, like, for example, the Gates and the Rockefellers and people like that come into it. So to what extent they share that sort of historical passion. But one thing that I would suggest that unites them is eugenics. I think that they genuinely, there is if you look at sustainable development, there is in almost everything there is a very strong thread of eugenics. So,
I suppose what I was asking is this group of global elites emergent, or is it more by design?
I think they've always been here. They've always been here. These are the the rulers of Mesopotamia. But I mean, basically, over thousands and thousands of years, we've always had tyrants because we've always subjected ourselves to this silly, I would say, belief in something called authority. It's a human condition to believe that somebody else needs to tell us what to do, otherwise we won't be able to do anything. I don't understand it, but that can only lead to tyrants. That's the only place that can lead, and that's what we've always had.
In this hierarchy, we've got we've got the central banks and the Bank of International Settlement. I think his name is Augustine Carstens, who's very high up. Are there people higher than that?
It's very hard to say. I mean, there's a lot of people, and this is not something that I've researched in any great depth. There is a lot of people that talk about something called the black nobility. Then if you go back a bit further, there's the Committee of 300 and all this kind of stuff. And it may be true, it may not. I don't know. And I mean, people that have researched it a lot more thoroughly than I have would be better placed to talk about that than I am. But from my perspective, although it would be fascinating to find out about that would be very interesting. It doesn't really matter, that I don't think, because we can see the people that are pushing the agenda. For example, the thing that I call the pseudo pandemic, what we're experiencing at the moment. We know who they are. We don't need to think, oh, is someone pulling their strings? I think we should just start with what's in front of our face. If subsequently it emerges that there are more people behind the machine, then fine. But we need to start with this first. Most people still think that they elect a leader who will shape policy, and who, if they don't like them, they can get rid of them and put in a new policy. People still fundamentally believe that all over the world. And until they understand that there are some aspects of policy that they just cannot affect, they can't change it because it's got nothing to do with democratic accountability. It's completely divorced from it. Because it's a system that is being operated ostensibly by tyrants who aren't interested in what we think. They're only interested in what we do, and they want to control that.
Is democracy dead?
It is if we don't do something. It's finished.
And what must we do?
I think we need to look to each other, and we need to look to the local community around us, and we need to start acting autonomously, because we at the moment are reliant for so much on, to the infrastructure that is around us, and that infrastructure is put in by government. So government have got control of that infrastructure and therefore got control of us. And when you think that government are partners or, partners in this global private-public partnership, then they have control of us, because we're reliant upon them. So the first thing we need to do, and that's something that I know that far more people do in South Africa than do in my country, is be independent of that, to be able to look after yourself, to be able to care for yourself and the people that you love, and to be able to care for your community. That is what we need to be focusing on.
I'm laughing because the reason why there's more independent or self-reliant attitudes in South Africa is because we have a failed state.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it?
Yes.
But we all need to be doing that, because we are going to have a failed state. very, very soon. Everyone is.
So, I mean, Iain, I look at all this information that you've got, and it really is phenomenal. What do you do with it, though?
What, me personally, or us generally?
You and, of course, us generally, both.
I mean, my objective is just to try and get people to think about things and question authority, really. I mean, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not going around, oh, well, listen to me, I know everything. I don't. I only know what I know, and there's loads more that, most things I don't know. There's a vast amount of knowledge out there that I haven't got a clue about. So all I am suggesting is that people should familiarize themselves with the way things actually work, not with the fantasy that they are given by the media and by the politicians, because it is a fantasy. It is a fantasy. They need to understand, and I totally understand that most people don't have the time and are living busy lives, and they don't have the time to perhaps go into the stuff in the depth that perhaps you and I have more time to do. I understand that, but at least ask questions. I mean, one of the things that has been so disheartening during this, we were talking earlier about the fact that we've got this new, what are they calling it, a super mutant variant now. I mean, super mutant. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, it sounds like it was written by Marvel. It's preposterous. I mean, but people just go along with it. I mean, a rudimentary sense of disbelief is what we need to develop. We need to stop accepting everything we're told just because someone is in authority. It's worth remembering that those people in authority are human beings with agendas. So you need to know who they are, what their agenda is, what they represent, and don't accept what they say simply because they're on the television with a suit on.
Yeah.
That's not good enough.
But
there needs to be evidence.
But the elephant in the room is that it seems like we are surrounded by people who are asleep.
Yeah, and I mean, that's probably why you and I are doing this, isn't it? Because we want them to not be. Because until you're not, it's only recently that I've been comfortable about talking about things like people being asleep or an awakening. Because to me, that sounds extremely arrogant. It's like we're saying, oh, we know something you don't. It's not about that. It's just about, I think it's probably a different mindset. I mean, the more people that I talk to that are aware of the deception that we are embroiled in at the moment, the more I see a kind of common attitude, and that is just simply healthy skepticism. It's just healthy skepticism and somehow many of our fellow, our compatriots have just given up that skepticism, and I don't know why, but it just seems that they don't question anything. That they could literally be told anything and go along with it. I mean, some of the things we have been told, like the super mutant variant that we've just been talking about, are laugh out loud funny. I mean, they're ridiculous. I mean, it's comical. There's no science behind any of this. It's all made up. It's made up nonsense. But we don't question it, or millions of us don't question it.
Why don't we question it?
I mean, it's so difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, no, we're all individuals. We're all different. Not everybody
I know, but I'm asking for your opinion.
Right. Well, when we're born, we are told from the from the cradle, we are told about authority, aren't we? We are told to respect our parents, respect authority, do what you're told. That is inculcated into us from the moment that we're wrapped in swaddling clothes. So we're kind of bred to obey authority. Now, when you're a child, that's a very important thing to do, because if your mum or dad say stop, you've got to stop, because you might get run over by a bus otherwise, or whatever. So that's important. But when we become adults, there needs to be a transition away from that mindset. We need to transition away from simply obeying authority to taking individual responsibility for our actions in all things. I think having an interest in history helps in terms of a perspective, because history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does have patterns. And you can if a historical perspective can give you some sort of insight into the same thing happening again. So I think there are many different aspects, and there are many different ways that we can come to question authority. But that is the fundamental thing that we need to do as a species. And I mean as a species, we need to do that. We need to be less trusting of authority figures. And that doesn't mean that we have to disbelieve what we're told. I'm not suggesting that we have to disbelieve everything, but if you see a piece of information or somebody tells you something, go to the sort of basic fundamental principles. What is the evidence to back up what they are saying? I mean, with the super mutant variant, the evidence is non-existent. It is just made up. But it's so hard for people to believe that, because the Prime Minister or in our case the Health Secretary is standing in the Houses of Parliament speaking authoritatively about the super mutant variant, and that's enough for most people, because they cannot believe that, in this case, he would lie like that. They can't believe it.
And yet they have a history of lying.
Yeah, and yet, who doesn't? I mean, this is the weird, isn't it? This is the juxtaposition that's so strange. Who do you not know? Who do you know that doesn't think politicians are corrupt? Everybody thinks politicians are corrupt, and yet we still believe what they say, even though most people don't believe. Normally wouldn't trust them.
Is humanity on a cliff edge?
We are in a big. This is it. We are in a big existential fight for survival. So I mean, I don't know whether you, but going back to something else I was saying earlier, the people that we're up against aren't thinking that they're going to win this next week. They've got a long-term strategic plan. Now, I don't know why, I've discussed it in my book, why I suspect they may have acted when they did, because if you look at the coronavirus story, it's not actually that good. There are so many holes in it. You kind of think it's almost as if they went off a bit half-baked, like, oh, we've got to do this now. And I think if you look at the collapse of the international monetary and financial system that was clearly started with the collapse of the repo market in America, then I think there's an element of, we've got to go now. This is the time now, otherwise we're not going to be able to recover this. That is speculation. But I mean, that's the only thing that I look at where I think, because I do think that there are so many shortcomings in the story of the virus and of coronavirus that it's almost as if it wasn't quite, the plan wasn't quite fully formed when they went with it.
But I mean, the plan can't actually be that fully formed when you're dealing with so many people and so many variables.
Well, I mean, No, it's true. You know that you have to sort of be able to prepare for contingencies, but that's how compartmentalized authority works. So with a compartmentalized authoritarian structure like the Global Public-Private Partnership, not everyone knows what's going on. I mean, there are plenty. I mean, if we look at our backbench MPs in the UK, I mean, it seems to me that most of them believe everything. I mean, they believe what they're told, and they like the rest of the population. They're not privy to any kind of skullduggery, but those at the top are manipulating the situation. So, and in that moment, they are able to, control agendas of what people are working towards, but the people that are doing it don't necessarily know that they're moving towards a controlled agenda. They think they're just responding to an international crisis.
In front of you, Iain, there is a crystal ball. What do you see?
I think we've got every reason to be hopeful at this point, because I think one of the things that I found most encouraging is the fact that there are lots of people who are double vaccinated, who are suddenly realizing that they're now on a treadmill, that now in the UK and in America and everything, they're talking about the booster shot. So the number of people who have questioned this from the start, that have been sort of kind of skeptical about the whole narrative from the start, is, I would say, a relatively small part of the population. But there's a lot more people who probably took the vaccine just because they wanted to go on holiday, or they wanted to see their friends, or they wanted to travel, who I think were aware of the people that were questioning it more vociferously, but thought, nah, I just want to go on holiday, so I'll take the vaccine. But now they're saying no. Only a few months later, they're saying no. Now you need a booster, and now they've come up with this idea of the super mutant variant, which is the reason why you need your booster. That group of people, who outnumber us by orders of magnitude, if they decide that no, we're not going along with this anymore, then we're going to be talking, 20, 30%, maybe more of the population. When we get to that level, then I would suggest that, it's going to be very, very, very difficult for them to enforce their will. If it comes to military confrontation, not military, but if it comes to physical confrontation with the authorities, when you've got a population of that sort of size who are opposed to what is happening, if they're being peaceable and they're being reasonable in their arguments, there are going to be many, many people in law enforcement who are going to agree with them, and the military, and the civil service. And so when it's not a fait accompli that they're just going to be able to order the what we consider probably the security services and so forth to suppress us ruthlessly, there are going to be lots of people within that don't agree, and they're going to have. I think everyone is going to be faced with a question of conscience. Everyone. Some people, it won't matter because they just think that we're all, scum-sucking anarchists and probably deserve to die. But they're a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. Most human beings are good. Most human beings are reasonable. We might have a broad swathe of opinions, but we're not bad. We have been, especially with the sustainable development, we have been kind of trained to think that we're bad. We can't do anything, we can't function, we have to rely on the government to sort everything out for us. We can't treat each other with respect. We're all useless eaters that are going around using up resources and destroying the planet in the process. We're basically a parasite. And that gets internalized. We start to believe it, and it is not true. It is not true. People are good. People are kind. People are creative. We're not each other's enemy. We are in this together. And when we realize that, then there is every reason to hope that we can fend off what is happening.
You said in this together, and let's just segue from there. Where can people find more of your work?
Yeah, no, that's the name of my website as well. Yeah, it's in this together. It's dashes between the word. It's in this together.com. Yeah, and that's where I write. I also write for somebody else that I highly recommend that people check out is the UK column. In the UK, they have been absolutely brilliant throughout the whole thing. I mean, they've got a fantastic team there that have been working really hard to try and bring the evidence to the public. I write for them as well occasionally. And then there's my Odyssey channel, which is in this together.
Good man. You said Odyssey. Well done.
Yeah, my Odyssey channel. I am ashamed to admit that I have a YouTube channel, but I'm doing everything I can to get banned. I've had a few strikes. The thing is, I can't even be bothered to load anything to YouTube, but I'm just going to load some stuff on just so that I can get banned, I think. And then, yeah, so check me out. And I've recently written a book, which the PDF and the EPUB version are free on my website. You don't have to pay for it. Just sign up to my newsletter and I'll send you a copy. So, and then if you want a hardback, then that is available through the website as well. But and everything I do, the EPUB version and the electric version and everything, all my writing is all Creative Commons. It's all free. Just take it, use it, PDF. I've started recently doing a PDF of all my posts underneath the posts. I've only done a few, but print them off, share them out, do whatever. But we need to get all the information out to people, and we need to start showing them that, we've got to stand up to this, because otherwise, it is the end of the way of life, our way of life as we understand it.
Iain Davis, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Don't go anywhere. My name is Jerm. This is JermWarfare, the battle of ideas.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please visit supportjerm.com.